This conference
A
will
very good
now be
evening to
recorded.
everyone. Welcome to Wednesday webinar. Welcome to the Wednesday webinars. I thank you all for your participation, and I would also like to mention that our seminar is open for our entire KDO family. So you can forward our messages for the webinar to other group so that maximum people can benefit. Also, if you have any suggestions for any topic you want us to cover, you can contact us for that. Uh, some basic guidelines. Uh, I would request everyone to keep your audio and video on mute. Question answers will be taken at the end. And any questions you have, you can post it on the chat box. And so our today's topic is related party transactions from tax and other regulatory other regulations point of view by speaker CA Anjul K. Mota. Anjul K. Mota is an experienced professional in international taxation and transfer pricing profile. He is currently working as an associate director in BSR and Company LLP. He has an experience of over 13 years working on various planning, litigation, and compliance assignments for various inbound and outbound clientele across India and Middle East. Now, not wasting much of the time, I would hand over to CA Anjul Mota. Sir, you can take it from here. Thank you.
Thank you, Payal. Pleasure to be in front of the alumni, the respected seniors and fellow colleagues from the community. It's really a pleasure. It's my first speaking session at the KDOC Association, so it's very special for me. Thank you for inviting me. So today we are going to discuss on the related party transactions. Largely, we will focus the discussion on the tax and regulatory perspective, just keeping the accounting aspect separately. So nowadays, of late, we have been seeing a lot of news which has arisen in the corporate world. It has largely been into, it's been for right reasons, for wrong reasons. There is a lot of buzz in the corporates. What is happening, why it is happening. Is it because of those related party transactions? So this has really been the catchphrase in the corporate world recently. So there are few words which you typically be hearing on a day-to-day basis, but we may not realize it. So what are these words? Transparency, governance, independence, tax planning, protecting investor and minority interests. These are the kind of aspects that are being very widely, thoroughly discussed, not just at board level, but even at the level of the CXO level, where because everyone, these are such vexed and such important issues, such important matters. They are so related party transactions is prevalent globally. In India also it is prevalent. In India, it is not as regulated or as matured as other countries, but over the years we have matured quite well than others. The regulators typically face a difficulty in balancing out the two broad aspects. One is protecting the shareholder / the investor interests. Secondly, easing the cost of doing business, easing the processes, reducing the compliance to a minimum level. It is a very difficult task to achieve both. And in India, we have various regulators undertaking both of these aspects. So ranging from income tax authorities, Companies Act, MCA is regulating it. In case of listed companies, SEBI is regulating it. And there are various other laws which are prevalent. We would be dealing it day-to-day basis, but sometimes we don't even realize it. Recently, there have been a lot of news articles. Will 2020 mark a positive shift in India's corporate governance. SEBI proposes overall of related party transactions. RBI is planning to issue the guidelines. Investment depends on these governance practices. Historical data has shown that in case wherever there is a trust factor is more, there is a more robust policies in place for corporates. The corporates have always enjoyed a different level of respect and trust in the business community as well as in the overall regime. It's very important to balance out this corporate governance, and as and when India opens up, as and when businesses become large, businesses become big, businesses try to go to public, businesses try to tap into different sources of funding, into different markets, different products. It is very important to have the right image, the right policies, and more importantly, the trust factor with the community. And how do we achieve all these things? So let us first understand what are these related parties? What are the related party transactions? And what role can we play in this entire scheme? Let us talk about the introduction to the related parties in the transaction. In order to understand this, let us first understand what is transfer pricing and how do you price a particular transaction. In a very layman terms, transfer pricing is something where there is a purchase sale of goods or services. There could be some financing transactions. Now, if a transaction is between two related parties, there is a underlying implicit assumption that there may be a special influence for that pricing, and that when you link it with the pricing, you just try to see, when if two unrelated parties would have dealt in similar situation, what would have been the market price. So it is expected that even in a related party scenario, you will deal on the same basis as if you would have dealt with a third party. Some concepts of transfer pricing, some concept of the arm's length price. Now, arm's length price, the mechanism for this entire process is covered only in Income Tax Act and in somewhat sense in customs related provisions. In Income Tax Act, it's mentioned that any income which arises from a transaction with a related party will have to be computed as per the arm's length principle. Arm's length principle is something a price which has to be applied for between related parties, for a transaction between related parties in uncontrolled conditions. And what is arm's length transaction? Is a transaction where there is no conflict of interest. It's as good as it, although it is entered into between the related parties, it should have been conducted in a way that there is no actual or a perceived conflict of interest. Now, this is just a summary from the Income Tax Act and Companies Act, both read together. Let us move on to see the impact of transfer pricing in various regulations. First and foremost, this is something which affects everyone. Companies Act 2013. In Companies Act 2013, all related party transactions require the audit committee approval. There are certain transactions which also required board approval. In exception situation where the transaction exceeds certain threshold, there is also a shareholders approval which is required. We'll examine each of these concepts in detail as we move forward in our discussion. Then in case of listed companies, the SEBI corporate governance norms, the listing and disclosure norms kick in. SEBI requires a prior approval of the audit committee for all the related party transactions. In case of certain material related party transactions, there is a prior requirement of a prior approval from the shareholders. Just to touch upon the accounting from accounting perspective, Ind AS has increasingly put emphasis on recognition of substance over form. In fact, it also mentions about reclassification of certain transactions. And it is recommended that there should be a fair value based measurement for certain revenue arrangements, for certain financial instruments, and for certain PPE, which is property, plant, and equipment. Similarly, even in customs as well as GST, there is a classification of certain related party transaction to be valued at a fair value or at a market value. Of course, the objective between the customs authorities and the transfer pricing authorities has always been in a divergent direction. That has caused a lot of difficulty to many MNCs. But again, the objectives are different. So it requires a very careful planning and a very careful execution around both of these laws. I'm sorry. Let us now try to see why transfer pricing in a numerical example. Let's see situation 1, where as a group, I'm able to sell a particular goods to third party at say 140 rupees. My actual cost of production is only 60. The entire profit of 80 belongs to me. Now in situation 1, the group has planned its transfer prices in such a way that the parent company in India earns 30% margin on cost, which is a great margin as such. If you look at it unilaterally, you see in Dubai on a cost of 80, the profit is 60 and there is no tax. Having said so, if instead of one of the India or Dubai party being would have been a third party, or they would have dealt with it at arm's length, then instead of transfer which is happening from India to Dubai at 80 rupees would have happened at 120 rupees. And thereby the profit of India would have increased from 20 rupees to 60 rupees. So the transfer price has been arrived at in a manner that a profit of 40 rupees has been shifted from India to Dubai. Now this is all this with the increased transparency across the world, with this country by country report coming in for transfer pricing as a part of the OECD BEPS initiative, and a lot of regulators exchanging information with each other. Increasingly, we are seeing a lot of information being exchanged between customs and the transfer pricing officers, between income tax officers and the MCA, and in some cases even with the SEBI. So there is a need to overall have a balanced approach from all the sides. Let's look at now what is a related person. First, let's understand what is a related person under each of the acts. Let us first look at Income Tax Act, because that's where everything is defined in a more lucid manner. It is more tried and tested. Let's take 3 scenarios. Number 1, very simple scenario. Company A having a subsidiary, by management, capital, or control, it is able to influence that company. So the transaction between both the parties will be regarded to be a control transactions. Second scenario, where there is an intermediary in between. There is company A, then there is company B, and below company B there is another wholly owned subsidiary. So even in second case, if there are transactions between company A and company C, which is a subsidiary company, there is a high possibility that the transactions are controlled. In such case, that is also covered within the ambit of related persons. Company C, situation 3, where company A is having 2 subsidiaries. Both have no other connection with each other, but since they are controlled by company A is able to influence the transaction at which subsidiary company 1 and subsidiary company 2 transact with each other. In such a case, even transactions between these 2 fellow subsidiaries would come within the ambit of related party transactions. Now, Income Tax Act also defines certain deemed situations. by way of management capital control, but it has within each of these segments, it has defined some instances. Suppose one entity is able to appoint more than half of the directors or has common directors between the two companies, both parties will be regarded to be related parties. If there is a dependency in terms of raw material supply, in terms of influence of price, in case of sale of goods, dependency in case of technical know-how or any intellectual properties, or there is a common control whereby some third party is holding 26% or more of the voting power in each of these companies, then these two entities will be regarded to be a related party. There are certain, there is very typical, the very peculiar example also which is given here. In case of loans, suppose loan from company A to company B exceeds more than 51% of the total assets of company B, then company A and B will be related parties. Similarly, company A, it has given guarantees which exceeds more than 10% of the borrowings of company B. Even in such case, both the parties would be regarded to be a related party. Now comes the Companies Act. Again, a very wide, very wide definition of the related parties, broadly basketed into three segments. At a company level, it covers holding, subsidiary, and fellow subsidiary. As we noted from the Income Tax Act, there has to be a minimum investment of 26% in order to be regarded to be a related party. However, in case of a Companies Act, that threshold goes down to 20%. So even if there is a 20% share capital which is held by one entity directly or indirectly into another entity, both those entities will be regarded to be related parties. Very detailed regulation again exists for management level connection, which includes not only KMPs, the key management personnel, but even the relatives. And not just the relatives of the KMPs, but also the relatives of the other directors. So although director may not be a key management personnel, but if that director along with relative, for example, in case of a public limited companies, if any director, if a person is on a board of directors of one company A, and if he along with his relatives holds more than 2% share capital in another company, then the transaction between those two companies will also fall within the ambit of related party transactions. And what does relatives include? Parents, HUF members, siblings, spouse, children, and their spouses. So it's a very wide ambit. Similar to the Companies Act, even SEBI has defined the related parties. It simply says related party has the same meaning as defined in Companies Act 2013 or under the applicable accounting standards. Furthermore, it also mentions that if there is any person belonging to the promoter group, and which holds 20% or more shareholding in the listed entity, then that person or entity shall also be regarded to be a related party. I've just tried to draw down a quick comparison between Income Tax Act and companies/SEBI norms. On capital front, I think we've discussed this, so I'm not repeating it again. Directors, again we discussed, so I'm not discussing again. Loans, guarantee, again we discussed. Purchase of raw material and dependency on intangibles. This is one very important point, often overlooked, because these are the kind of norms like loan, guarantee, purchase, dependency on intangibles. These are typically not covered in the related party schedules. So when one is doing undertaking compliances for Income Tax Act or for any other purposes, one tends to overlook these provisions. But it's very important to work closely with a particular client, a particular taxpayer, and to see, that what are these, objectively look at each of the criteria and to determine whether two or more entities would qualify as a related party for each other. Besides this, in Companies Act, employer-employee relationship also gets covered, which is for the key management personnel and the directors. In case of JVs, although JV partners typically not consider AEs unless they qualify in the 26% criteria for the Income Tax Act purpose. Usually for Companies Act and for SEBI purposes, in either one of the definitions, they will usually qualify. And again, it will all depend on whether, with respect to the sole agent, the distributor, the concessionaire agent, the indenting agent, it will all depend on the outcome of serial number 1 to 6. So as you would have seen, the coverage of the related parties vis-a-vis the Companies Act and vis-a-vis the SEBI norms is quite elaborate, quite wide. I'll just take a moment here. If we have any questions, happy to take it, or we can move ahead.
I think there are no questions as of now.
Very good. Let us now evaluate what falls in related party transactions. Again, taking cue from Income Tax Act. Any purchase, sale of tangible, intangible property, services, lending, borrowing, any other mutual agreement, apportionment, contribution to any cost or expenses will qualify as a international transaction. Now, either in that case, one of the conditions is either or both of the transacting parties have to be, at least one of them has to be a non-resident. Very typically, there is one peculiar amendment which happened in 2012, is if there is any other transaction which has a bearing on the profit or income or losses or even the assets of such enterprise, of any of such enterprises, then that would still will fall within the ambit of the international transactions. Now, what could get covered here? If it is not a revenue item, it is merely a capital item, which maybe affects either the losses of the assets of the company. If it's merely a balance sheet transaction, there is still the need to be compliant with those regulations, with those provisions. Interestingly, in 2012, there was another amendment in the deemed international transaction. Now here, if I can draw your attention to, this is an associated enterprise. This is based outside India, say for example in the US. This is the Indian enterprise, and there is an unrelated party. Let's, for simplicity's sake, let's assume this unrelated person is also in the US. Now, if there is any transaction between this Indian entity and this unrelated party, pursuant to there being a prior agreement between these two parties, the associated enterprise and the unrelated person outside India, or the terms are determined in substance between these two entities, pursuant to which Indian enterprise merely goes and executes that work, even this transaction will fall within the ambit of transfer pricing. This looks very simple, but as such, it has got far-reaching ramifications. All the central procurement agreements could qualify under this. All the central facility services, various kind of transaction within the MNC groups could get classified under this. Let's look at another interesting section, section 92BA. If there are transactions between a tax holiday unit, whether it's inter-unit within the same legal entity or vis-a-vis the other legal entity, and the value of transaction exceeds 20 crore rupees in aggregate in a year, then the provisions of domestic transfer pricing kicks in. This limit was 5 crore earlier. Couple of years back, it was increased to 20 crores. This is a very interesting section. Typically, you have a SEZ unit or ATIA IB kind of unit, and within the same company, you may have operations outside SEZ as well. The operations within the SEZ qualify as a tax holiday for tax holidays. So normal tendency of a person would be to, let's keep more profit here, let's keep lesser profit outside. However, none of the authorities expect that. None of the authorities would take that. Neither the SEZ authorities would accept that, nor income tax authorities would accept that. So various situations we have seen that suppose there is a corporate level expense which is spent in DTA, the domestic tariff unit, and there is a reluctancy on part of certain taxpayers to actually cross charge those expenses to the tax holiday unit. Sometimes even for administrative difficulties it may be difficult, but increasingly we are seeing authorities questioning this kind of non-charging of expenses. Similarly, if there are certain income which the tax holiday unit should have charged to a domestic tariff unit and it is not charging, or vice versa, even that those things are being questioned by the authorities. We are seeing some increase in litigation around that point. An allied point to this is this interplay of section 92BA was combined with section 40A2B of the Income Tax Act. Anything paid in excess was primarily disallowed. This is also a ramification from the payer entity which is not a tax holiday unit. Suppose it is holding certain expenses with itself and not cross-charging it to the tax holiday unit. Then those expenses technically do not belong to itself. It's a possibility that these expenses could be disallowed by the income tax authorities in the hand of such non-tax holiday unit. A very careful exercise is required in such cases to determine whether there should be a cross charge from one unit to another, from one company to another, and at what price. That is very critical. Let's look at the related party definitions in the Companies Act. Section 188 is the mother of related party transactions in Companies Act. It defines everything is similar to the Income Tax Act, except for one or two points here or there, like in appointment of a related party to an office or a place of profit. Leasing of property has been profoundly pronounced, and it will all get covered within the ambit of the approval process. Now, section 177 of the Companies Act, which describes the provisions for audit committee. It covers various transactions, which whether they are defined within the ambit of section 188 or not. So that gives a wide-ranging power to Companies Act, not just look at related parties definitions is enhanced, but even related party transaction is enhanced. The definition in SEBI, now this is more important in a listed company, is while other points are same, transfer of resources, services, or even obligations between a listed entity and a related party gets covered within the ambit of related party transactions. There is also one more point here. Regardless of whether a price is charged. Now, if there is a free of cost transaction, still that transaction could get covered. And a transaction with a related party may be a single transaction or maybe several group of transactions in a contract. Again, I'll just hold for a moment in case we have any questions. Happy to answer at this point.
Anjul, I just need to give you one suggestion. I'm audible.
Can
you just can you just explain the concepts, giving a small example if you have the time, for bringing better clarity among the novice visitors, participants
Sure.
rather.
Is there anything in particular which you're looking at? Maybe I can go
That,
back to those slides.
Yeah, that SDT, what you were saying, if
Yeah.
you can just put a small example, it will bring about more clarity.
Sure. Happy to do that.
Thank
So
you.
let me illustrate this. Now let's assume there is one legal entity within which there is a unit in a special economic zone doing software activities, and there is another business undertaking which is outside the special economic zone. Both these units have a turnover of 100 crores. Both the units have a profit of 10 crore rupees. The head office is not in the special economic zone. The head office is outside the zone. Now there are certain costs. For example, the CFO office cost. For example, the CEO costs. Now usually the tendency of a person would be to reduce the administrative compliance and say that, okay, if I have received an invoice of a service provider, if I received certain costs in the name of the non-tax holiday unit, let me book these expenses in the non-tax holiday unit. Let's assume the expense, let's assume in both the entities, the profit is 10 crores. And out of this, 2 crore is the common cost. That 2 crore of common cost is lying in the non-SEZ unit. Because of which the profitability is of the non-SEZ unit is 10 crores, SEZ unit is 10 crores. Ideally, if that allocation would have happened, that 2 crore worth of cost would have got divided between non-tax holiday unit and tax holiday unit. As a simplicity proposition, let's assume that ratio would have been 50-50. That 1 crore of cost, what ideally should have been charged from the non-tax holiday unit to the tax holiday unit, it has not happened. So as such, the profitability of the tax holiday unit, which is exempt from tax, has got artificially increased from 9 crore rupees to 10 crores. And the profit of the non-SEZ unit, which was ideally 11 crores, has got artificially reduced to 10 crores. So as a taxpayer, as a company, that legal entity is paying tax only on 10 crores. Otherwise, it would have paid their tax on 11 crore rupees. Now, in this example, the numbers are 10 crores and 1 crore. In some situations, we have seen the numbers are very, very different. And that has caused a lot of litigation on this inter-unit transfers. Was that clear, sir?
Yes, very much clear. Thank you.
Great. So we move on to see what are the compliances for the related party transaction. What is the approval process? Let's debate that a little bit. I'll not get into too much compliance on the income tax front because I believe everyone is aware about it. In transfer pricing, there is a certificate which is required to be taken from a chartered accountant based on verifications of the related party transaction, the ledgers, the agreements, etc., etc. We determine whether the transactions are carried out as per arm's length principle. Now, typically, you would see that in an audit, we would have a chartered accountant gives a view that the documentation, the financial statement depict a true and fair view. Surprisingly, in accountant's report form, which has got notified in 2001 and that it still continues as it is, it says the prescribed documents have been maintained by a taxpayer, which are reported in this certificate, depict a true and correct picture, which is very, very wide ramification. How do you arrive at that? That on what basis am I concluding that it's a true and correct picture? So there is a requirement to maintain a compulsory mandatory requirement to maintain a transfer pricing documentation, which is covered as per section 92D read with rule 10D. Popularly, we refer to this as a transfer pricing report or as a transfer pricing study report. What does it cover? It covers 3 baskets of information. One is related to the entity, related to the what is the industry in which I'm operating, what is my group profile, what is my own profile, what is my profile of my related parties. Now, what do I mean by profile? Profile means industry is a wide forum. Where do I fit in the entire process? Where do I fit in the entire industry as a group, as a legal entity? What is my business? In a very concise manner, I try to fit in that. Then I get into a transaction level information or a price related information where I describe what are the key terms of the transaction, what is the activities that Indian entity is doing, what is the activities that the other entity is doing, what are the kind of capital funds, what are the kind of assets deployed by both the parties, what are the kind of risks which are undertaken by both the parties. Now, when I say risk, it's not merely what is written in the agreement, but what you actually have faced, and that would be very evident from the respective books. Besides this, one may also need to look at the forecasts, the budgets, and thereafter look at the comparable companies. Now, these comparables could either be internal comparables within the company itself, or one may have to look outside in the industry. There is a requirement to contemporaneously maintain and manage this documentation. So when I issue a form 3CEB, the transfer pricing certificate, I am required to have a basic transfer pricing documentation as mentioned in Rule 10D on a contemporaneous basis, on a real-time basis, failing which there are severe penalties. And I am required to maintain that documentation for a period of 8 years. Let's look at the approval process for the Companies Act now. So in a Companies Act, once I have a related party transaction, first and foremost, I need to take an approval of audit committee. Now here I have just used short forms like AC refers to audit committee, WOS refers to wholly owned subsidiary. In Companies Act, there are 2 parameters. First, analyze whether the transaction is carried out in the ordinary course of business. If yes, great, proceed to the next level. If no, go to the board, take the approval, then move forward. If the transaction is carried out, if transaction is in an ordinary course of business and the transaction is carried out at arm's length, I did not do anything further. Straight away the transaction is approved. However, if the transaction is not at arm's length, then I need to go to board. In either of these situations, if I don't qualify even one of these situations and I take the board approval, there are certain thresholds which are prescribed. If I don't meet those thresholds, then I need to determine whether I am a wholly owned subsidiary. If yes, nothing to be done further. If no, I need to take a shareholders approval. Now, shareholders approval is a very important step here, especially in a public limited companies. In public limited companies, the resolution would require to be passed at a general body, and voting shall be, and interested party will not be allowed to vote at that board meeting. Similar exemption, similar provision does not exist for a private limited company. Now, in case of in December 2015, a year after this section was introduced, section 188, a lot of companies faced a lot of issues, and then they made representations. For every transaction, I need to go through this process of audit committee, board, shareholders. The entire process is taking a lot of time. So why not MCA grant some kind of a approval where the audit committee gives a omnibus approval at the start of the year. So let's examine what is the process for the omnibus approval. What do I mean by omnibus approval is the list of, there is a set of specific transactions with a specific pricing, and it's a very routine kind of thing. So if it's very repetitive, very routine, audit committee will say, okay, this is something which I'm seeing on a year-to-year basis, depending on the need for such omnibus approval, and whether if it is in interest of the company, the audit committee will approve it for the full year. There would be certain transactions which are not material, but you can't anticipate that at the start of the year. So audit committee also has the power to provide a blanket approval for transactions up to 1 crore rupees, where the need for those related party transaction or any more details, you don't have it. But since it's not very material, you may do it during the normal course of business. This omnibus approval is valid only for one financial year. So every financial year, at the start of the financial year, you are required to take that approval. What is the criteria for setting the omnibus approval by audit committee? First of all, first and foremost, it has to be approved by the board of directors. Secondly, maximum value of this total transaction which has been approved for omnibus approval has to be mentioned in the omnibus approval process. Within that, each of the transaction has to be approved. Further, extent and the manner of disclosure, how it will be presented, when it will be presented before the audit committee, all that entire policy has to be drawn up. And again, there has to be a review mechanism to the entire process. Furthermore, and most importantly, the transactions which are not covered within the omnibus approval have to be very clearly mentioned by the audit committee. What are the typical contents of the omnibus approval? Besides the name and the nature of transaction, what is the period and extent of the transaction? What is the basis on which the prices have been fixed? And what is the leeway for any price adjustment if that has to be done? Every goods, every service cannot be a uniformly priced for the entire year. So there may be certain formula which is prescribed. So usually it is very objectively driven formula which is prescribed here. Let's look at now what if in case transaction, if it is either not in the course of ordinary course of business, which again is not a defined concept in Companies Act. It is again to the knowledge and judgment of the respective board of directors and the audit committees, and or if it is not at arm's length, then and it is beyond certain prescribed limits, then a shareholder approval is required. What are the prescribed limits? Earlier the limit was fixed at 100 crores without, which was not very objective. Recently the MCA has revised these transaction limits, whereby most of these transactions, for example, the supply of goods related, the supply of the leasing of property, and the availing or provision of services has been pegged at 10% of the turnover or 100 crores. In case of services at 50 crores, whichever is lower. If that threshold is not breached, you need not go to the shareholders for the approval. In case of property related transaction, the criteria changes from 10% of turnover to 10% of net worth or 100 crores, whichever is lower. In case of appointment of a related party to an office or a place of profit, for example, if I am appointing a related party to a managing director position, which is regarded to be a place of profit, or as a sole selling agent in one of the territories, then a monthly remuneration, if it does not exceed 2.5 lakh rupees, I did not take a shareholder approval. Then whatever board decides, that's fine. Similarly, for underwriting of the shares and securities, if the company is paying a remuneration which does not exceed 1% of its net worth, then again there is no need for a shareholder approval. So MCA has been quite liberal. Vis-a-vis this, we have seen that SEBI is becoming more and more strict, and that is important because in case of listed company, there is more public trust involved, more public money involved, and definitely there is a lot of press surrounding it. Compliance as per SEBI regulations, again, on compliance front is not very difficult process. You need to maintain a policy, regularly update it, keep it on your website. You need to take a prior approval of the audit committee for all the related party transactions. Shareholder approval is required for material related party transaction. The levels for materiality are again prescribed, and somewhat they are also left on the company. Compliance report on corporate governance to be submitted on a quarterly as well as on an annual basis. May I just pause here to take any questions, if any?
Hello, I have one question.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to know that shareholder approval, whether this is required for private limited company also?
The shareholder approval, no, it's not required for the private limited companies. Usually in private limited companies, you will see that there would be very, very few transactions which will not qualify either in ordinary course of business, or in some circumstances you may not able to come to a conclusion with a transaction at arm's length or within the prescribed limits. However, having said so, there still may be very, very rare situation where those things may happen. If that's there, yes, shareholders approval required, but related parties are allowed to vote on those transactions.
You mean to say if the transaction are crossing the threshold limit of the suppose 10% of your
10%.
turnover, so
Yeah.
yeah, then shareholder approval is required for private limited company
Yes.
also.
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Shall we move to the next bit?
Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, so here now let's look at, so far we've touched upon Companies Act, so far we touched upon income tax and the SEBI regulations. Let's now look at the interplay of customs, GST, transfer pricing. What methods do you apply? How do you implement this? What documentation you need to maintain? So let me touch upon first on the customs valuation. This customs is a process where the authorities will assign some value to the goods at the time of import or export. It is paid on the transaction value as submitted to the customs authorities. If they arrive at a different value, then the taxpayer will be required to pay for those goods separately. In a related party scenario, there are certain methods which has been prescribed, and they have to be followed in that particular hierarchy. I'll just touch upon that in the next slide. First of all, the definition of the transaction value. It refers to the price which is actually paid or payable when the goods are sold for export to India, or at the time of import, to put it very simply. That is when applicable when the buyer and seller are not related, and price is the sole consideration for the sale. Now, what is included in the value of transaction or the transaction value as has been defined in the customs valuation rule of 2007? Besides the cost, the manufacturing or the cost to the seller, it includes the freight, royalties, licenses, any other payments which is made as a part of condition of sale to satisfy the seller's obligation. These are the few points which would be covered as a part of the value of transaction for customs competition. This is, as we all are aware, there is a specific provision for special valuation branch. This is to speed up process as well as to give certainty to the importers. So in this case, there is a specific team within customs which clears these goods based on the valuation, which has gained significant importance. There are certain time period within a span of 2 months. They have to come back with the value assigned. The importer pays duty on some provisional basis. Once the order gets finalized, it may be required to pay additional duty. CBEC has also issued a circular in 2016 whereby they have provided a mechanism how to examine the related party transactions. Now I have just tried to compare here the different approaches in customs and the transfer pricing methods. In customs, there is a particular hierarchy of the methods which has to be followed in terms of this rule 3 for first check rule 3, which provides for assessable value, which is equal to the value of transaction. Whether that transaction value is similar for the identical goods between related buyers and unrelated buyers, or thereafter, then if that does not get classified, then look at other rules. So first and foremost, we'll look at rule number 4, which is identical goods. If there is one piece of mobile which is imported by a related party, whether same kind of a mobile is imported from a unrelated party also by the same company or maybe by a different company, but if it is same brand, same specifications kind of mobile, it will qualify under rule 4. Let's presume that in a MNC scenario, this may not exactly be possible. For example, if Samsung Korea is selling to Samsung India, it will not sell the same goods to any other party. So in those cases, it may qualify under rule 5, which should be similar goods. So the importer of Samsung India can compare, the prices can be compared with importer of say Apple phones or some other phones if they have similar performance but may not be alike in all the aspects. Similarly, thereafter there is rule number 7, which provides for a resale price of imported goods minus certain importation commission, expenses, and transportation and customs duty. Now this is akin to the resale price method which exists in transfer pricing. Then there is a computed value, which is a cost plus kind of approach. Again, this cost, what is your cost of production plus profit plus certain expenses and transportation, etc. These are all prescribed. And the last and the final rule is best judgment. Now this is a method where nothing else can work, and so if your cost of production is not available, if your resale price minus your importation commission, etc., all these kind of values are not available even with the customs authorities, then they will go on a best judgment basis. Similar provisions exist in transfer pricing also, but in that case no hierarchy is prescribed. In this case, most appropriate method has to be applied. It could be any one of this, and there is no hierarchy. So in a situation, there would be situations where in case of commodities, in case of say oil and gas products, in case of coal or other mining related products, there's a good possibility that there is a cup available. In case of shares and securities, there is a good possibility there is a cup available. Resale price method. This may work better in case of a pure reseller, pure distributor who does not add too much value to the goods. He merely imports and then resells it in the Indian market. The resale price method will work very well. Now this is akin to the deductive value approach in customs, which is there. Cost plus method, globally used very widely, not used too much in India because the databases, the external databases do not have accurate information about the cost of production. Hence, this method is not very widely used in India, but globally it's very well used. In India, typically you would see 60-70% cases would be using transactional net margin method, which is a entity level or a segment level net profit comparison. There's one more method which although is not mentioned on the slide, is a profit split method. Now, since there was no equivalent method to customs, I have not captured it. But again, it has its own set of challenges. It can work only when both the parties are working in a very integrated fashion, or they are both contributing some unique aspects to a transaction, like say intangibles. In those cases, profit split works best, but it's a very complex one. It is largely used only in the mature markets, mature economy. And then there is other method In that case, you can take a say a indicative price which is available on a stock exchange, or maybe something which is available in public domain. Something can be valuation can be undertaken. For example, for shares, some quotation or list price is available. Say on commodity exchanges, you can take that as a reference point. In case there is a loan or a guarantee, one may take a reference point from a bank, that what would have been the indicative price if I would have taken if I would have undertaken this transaction with a third party. I can use other method in such cases. Similar rule also exists in GST. I am not getting too much into this because I understand everyone is aware about this rule. What is the illustrative documentation that one needs to maintain is agreements. Very, very important. Commercials, related correspondence, how a particular pricing is arrived at, what are the terms of the transaction, be it in terms of letters, emails, or any other correspondences exchange, minutes of meeting, the basis on which the respective CXO level people or boards of the entities have agreed at that pricing. What is the commercial rationale behind entering into a particular transaction? All these documentation is very critical. The transfer pricing documentation report, again, a very critical document. The functional risks analysis which is done is the primary thing on which reliance is placed by transfer pricing income tax authorities. Nowadays we are seeing a lot of customs related correspondences, including special valuation branches, have been calling for transfer pricing report, so as to check what method you are applying there, what method you are applying here, somewhere you are not making some different claims in different processes. Then invoices, the industry reports, the credit rating analysis, the analyst or the brokerage reports. These are the few documentation which are very, very critical. Now, what are the penalties for if I do not maintain these compliances? Income tax, as you all are aware, very stringent penalties for non-maintenance, non-reporting, incorrect reporting. The penalties are linked to a percentage of value of transaction, which is 2% for every failure. Failure to maintain, failure to report, failure to even furnish incorrect report. If there is a deemed concealment, earlier the penalty was 100 to 300%. Now it has changed to 50% and 200% respectively, and in section 270A. There is a failure if I fail to furnish the transfer pricing certificate in form 3CB, penalty is 1 lakh rupees. Other than that, I think everything other than that is linked to the value of the transactions. In case of Companies Act and the SEBI, the penalty is not very stringent in case of companies right now. There is a monetary fine. However, there is a risk of prosecution and the disqualification. In case of listed companies, SEBI has now prescribed a penalty. They have also recently constituted a working group which has provided far more stringent penalties and far more non-compliance related implications, like possibility of moving the shares for trading to Z category, and in extreme situations it may also involve suspension of trading. Increasingly we are seeing there is a lot of news in the market, in the media, which brings possibility of public disrepute to the company. So no one would want to typically contravene the provisions of these Companies Act or SEBI provisions and try to be aligned as much as possible. I'm happy to take any questions, if any, so far. I would just like to spend a couple of minutes on the key takeaways. What is required here? A proactive level of planning, a very robust policies which stand the test of the time, especially in the given situation. Increasingly, we are seeing the regulators share the information with each other very seamlessly. A lot of information available in public domain. It's very easy for any of the, be it the tax officer or be it the regulators, to tie up the loose ends from one filing to another filing, from information which is there on the website with the information which is available in the public media. And there is a lot of convergence which is seen between various authorities. So this brings in a very important point, that I need to be consistent in my reporting systems, in my compliances, in the method in which I'm justifying my prices, in the mechanism. So if there is a need to build in flexibility, if there is a need to change my prices, if they have remained consistent over the years, one should relook at the same. That brings us to the end of the presentation. I'm happy to answer any questions that we may have.
I have one question. Hello.
Yeah.
Yeah, further to my earlier question regarding shareholders approval, I just want to know whether the shareholder approval will be required to be taken before entering into transaction, or ratification is okay, taken in AGM is okay.
I'm sorry, Neeta Ben, is your question in context of the private limited company?
Yeah, private limited company.
So I think there is SEBI had a restriction in terms of prior approval, but for private limited company, you can ratify it at a later point in time.
Okay, thanks. And one more, the TP study report. Apart from TP study report, like TP study report covers almost many documents as such. So which are the critical documentation to be kept by auditor apart from TP study report?
So apart from TP study report, you know, most important thing would be the commercial related discussions. Whatever, I understand there will be confidentiality to a lot of things, but the board minutes, the audit committee minutes, if as an auditor I can get a copy of these two information besides the agreement, I think would be easily shareable. But other than agreements, I think how the commercials have been arrived at, what are the underlying, on what basis the audit committee and the board has approved the transaction, it is very critical to look at those documents.
Okay, thank you.
Anjal bhai, can you hear me?
Yeah.
This is Divya here, Divya Momaya.
Yeah, Divya.
I had a question that, say for example, if the company is entering into the related party transaction with two, three people, like you know, the director, the wife, or relative of a director. So, can a blanket approval be taken for all the transactions by single resolution for private limited? I'm talking of. Or we should have a separate resolution for every related party transaction and for each transaction. So can we go for a blanket approval for the entire group of relatives?
Yes,
what
certainly.
would be ideal practice basically?
So ideal practice would still be, if to the extent possible. So I think in omnibus approval slide, I have covered this point and I have just displayed this. So let's presume this will get covered under omnibus approval. If I'm able to specify the name of the party, nature of transaction, and period, value of transaction, the basis on which the prices have been fixed, or at least even if a formula is prescribed, I think that should be enough. Having said so, there is also a provision. I'm not sure whether I mentioned it very clearly, but there is a blanket approval up to 1 crore, which is possible. If details are not available for a related party transaction, possibly, if you don't have enough clarity at the start of the year, you can take this use this provision of blanket approval.
Okay, thank you.
But the value is not very significant. So it covers only very small transactions.
Okay. I must say the entire presentation was very crisp, and so many points have been covered. Probably as a company secretary, I had not even thought of so many angles to a related party transaction. But thank you so much for covering it in so detail. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
Any other questions? Uh,
Is there any questions now? I think there are no questions. So, Jai Jinendra, and good evening to one and all. I'm so lucky to get opportunity to present a vote of thanks for such a wonderful seminar. On behalf of KDOCA Association and on behalf of all the participants, I sincerely thank Anjul Mota for such a wonderful seminar. You have explained transfer pricing, related party transaction in such a simple and easy way that we understood everything. Really, you have covered each and every point, almost everything. So, big thank you to you. I would also like to thank Ghanshyam for starting this Wednesday webinar series. I would like to thank Raj and Charvik and all the committee members for organizing this seminars. And it's really useful to all the KDO community. And yes, how can I forget all the participants? So thanks to all the participants who have joined this webinar. Keep joining. Here is one more webinar we are coming out with on this Saturday. It will be on amendments in TDS, TCS, charitable trust and presumptive taxation provisions by CA Mehul Shah. Very knowledgeable person, a known person, and do attend this webinar on Saturday, 16th May at 5 p.m. to 6:30 p.m. Thanks again to one and all. Stay safe, stay home, be happy, take care of yourself. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this excellent forum, and all the best to everyone. Thank you. God bless.
Thank you.
Thank you, Anjul.
Thank you, Ghanshyam Bhai. Thank you, Charvik, Raj.